How's it going, folks? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and today I've got something a little bit different for you. You see, recently I made a guest appearance on the Reading Orwell podcast, which is an academic podcast that centres around the life and works of George Orwell. This podcast is run by my PhD supervisor, academic hero, and all-round top bloke, Dr Nathan Waddell. And as Nath explains in the podcast, in this episode we discuss 1984 and endotextuality, which is a concept I've devised over the course of my PhD. Now, Nath very graciously agreed that I could host this episode of the podcast here on YouTube. Now, if you like the conversation that Nathan and I have in this podcast, do check out Reading Orwell, which is available in all good places where podcasts are available. So, Apple Music, Spotify, that sort of thing. If you really like hearing me and Nathan chat about dystopian fiction, please be sure to let me know by leaving a comment down in the comment section below, because that might help to inspire or motivate us to do a slightly different project moving forwards. Anyway, without any further ado, let's hop over to the Reading Orwell podcast.
Welcome back to Reading Orwell. I'm Nathan Waddell, and today I chat with fellow Dystopias enthusiast Liam Knight, currently a PhD student at the University of Birmingham and indeed one of my supervisees there. Alongside his studies, Liam runs the brilliant, mainly GCSE level educational resource DystopiaJunkie, which you can find on YouTube. Liam's thesis assesses the idea of what he calls endotextuality in 20th and 21st century dystopian fiction, the role of texts within texts, or books within books. The word endotextuality shares some similarities with a word like endoscopy or endothermic, that is, a looking or absorbing into something. Endotexts are texts that other texts have absorbed into themselves in some fashion, and that invite us to think about the relationship between levels of text in a given work. One of Liam's focal works is 1984, whose endotextual implications comprise the main subject of what we have to talk about. What is the relationship of the Newspeak Appendix to the main narrative of Orwell's novel? Why is Goldstein's book so important? These are just some of the questions we address. The discussion begins in the middle of things, with me asking Liam about how endotexts typically fit into a given work or longer text. So if you got your novel within which there are endotexts and fed it into, a word processing document, you could in effect delete all the text that wasn't the endotext and still be left with the endotext, and you could read it as if it were a text of its own, unto its own, of its own right, in its own right, sorry.
No, totally. And I think even more recently, as I've been thinking more and more about endotextuality and getting deeper in it in my research, I'm starting to believe almost that, and maybe this is controversial to say, that you probably could delete the rest of the novel, the work. You could delete the main narrative, as I call it. And even though you are going to be left with one or multiple quite short texts, I think if I said to you, these letters come from a novel about whatever, I think you could see from there what the novel is actually about. And I don't mean like its plot or whatever. I mean maybe its deeper thematic concerns, its messages, its purpose. I think the endotexts actually can, because they are they're functioning so brilliantly as microcosms of their main narratives. I think you could potentially do without the rest of the narrative and still understand what the central message, concern, themes of it are.
It's almost like a test, isn't it, of the narrative integrity. So one way of knowing, in other words, whether an endotext is in fact crucial to the narrative is its degree of essentialism, its essential quality, whether it in fact does contain the sort of the core of what's going on. I mean, in 1984, we've got an interesting double status, I suppose, to the endotext there, which we might get to in a moment, in that, yes, they do contain a great deal of what the novel is addressed to investigate and also resist. But at the same time, one might make the claim, and people do, that they're sort of part of the story as well, in the sense that they're sort of instruments of the state, aren't they, at some level. I mean, you tell me, what are the endotexts in 1984?
There are so many, Nathan, and I think that's why I'm so drawn to Orwell in particular when looking at endotextuality. It's probably worth me clarifying very briefly, like the different categories of endotexts as I see them. I argue there's three main categories of endotexts. Those are the written and or read endotext, so something that characters are reading and or writing in their narratives. There's the parallel endotext, which sits alongside and almost at the same textual or narratological level as the main narrative. They don't directly interact with each other, but kind of still belong to a broader story world. And then there's the critical endotext after that, which comments on the main narrative and its story world. So it kind of sits above and embeds the main narrative rather than being embedded by it. So in 1984, for example, we have obviously very prominently the written endotext that is Winston's diary. We also have very prominently the written endotext that is Winston's work in the Ministry of Truth when he fabricates and writes the report about Comrade Ogilvy. We have, of course, Goldstein's book, or I always get the title wrong. Nathan.
Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism.
Thank you. It's not in front of me right now. Goldstein's book's much easier. So we have Goldstein's book, which again is another read endotext. And for the major or the most notable endotext in 1984, we also have The Principles of Newspeak, which is a critical endotext.
Would the Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, Goldstein's book, does that qualify as both read and written?
So when I say read and written endotext, they can be read or written, so not necessarily having to be both of those. Where I would see there being a written endotext, crucially, the act of writing it needs to be seen. So we need to sort of see characters go through the process of writing it. So of course, if you believe O'Brien when he claims that he and other members of the inner party wrote Goldstein's book, that's great. But because we don't see that process, because that process is not narrativized for us, I wouldn't count it as a written endotext in that way.
Again, doesn't it cover both? As in, it's written, we see extracts of it, and he presumably is reading them to himself as he's dwelling on it.
Yeah, I guess true. I think more it depends on the extent to which the act of reading is present within the novel and kind of like the commentary that then generates. So with Goldstein's book, which of course is huge and lengthy, and I want to talk about that aspect of it a bit later maybe. With Goldstein's book, we have Winston pausing to comment on it. We have Winston turning around in bed to Julia to remark on something that he thinks really fascinating about it, only for her to be sound asleep. That is like an essential part of the read endotext, is not only the fact that it is present and the character reads it, but we see then their response to reading it as well. What that act of reading does for the character is quite an essential part of the read endotext. And then I guess conversely, what the act of writing does and composition does is quite an essential characteristic of the written endotext.
We've already got some nuances emerging even within the distinctions that you're working with, which is of course the way this always tends to go. I mean, theory often brushes up against particulars, and one has to sort of think about it. I mean, it seems to me that one of the benchmarks or standards that you're appealing to in order to make sense of some of these gradations is the question of priority. What exactly seems to be the most important emphasis with which you're working in thinking about, say, whether it matters to call Winston Smith's diary written or read, or which one to prioritize as a way to begin analyzing it in the terms of your investigation. So we've got those things. You mentioned also parallel and critical endotexts. So could you tell us what those things are?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there are no examples of parallel endotexts in 1984. But this, I'm thinking of an example. For instance, Omar El-Akkad's American War, which is published in sort of the last decade or so. In between each chapter is a diegetic text. That might be clippings from newspaper reports. It may be an archival document. It may be an interview. There's also like a brilliantly redacted letter. So there we have in-world texts that relate to either the plot or the thrust of the narrative, or just its story world more broadly. That maybe elucidates some knowledge, some understanding, some wisdom about what's going on in the main narrative, but it never directly comments on what's happening in the main narrative. So in American War, to give it a very brief summation, it's about a character called Sarat Chestnut, and she is, in essence, caught in the middle of an American Civil War brought about by fossil fuel usage. And the narrative chronicles her sort of journey from displaced young woman to radical to essentially terrorist. And she is variously implicated in the war because of that. She, in part of the novel, assassinates a political figure, and then we see around the same place in the novel itself, we then get a report of that assassination. But nowhere does it say, and Sarat is a very bad person, etc., etc. It's just treating the narrative event as if it was a actually occurring thing, and providing maybe some different stances or opinions from other characters in the novel on it. So that's the parallel endotext. We're sort of ducking and weaving between the main narrative, the thrust of the story, and these texts that are maybe clarifying what's happened in it, that are maybe adding extra information. Sometimes they're completely unrelated to the plot and are just about the story world more broadly. The critical endotext is then an endotext that treats the occurrences of the main narrative as if it's happening and has happened and is directly then commenting on it. So, for instance, you might then look to frame narratives more broadly. So, if we were to look at Jack London's The Iron Heel, that begins with an introduction, ostensibly written by Anthony Meredith, a future historian in this story world. And he is directly commenting on what the Everhards are doing and the oligarchy that's emerged and so on. It's directly commenting on those characters, their actions, the plot, and also maybe sort of problematizing it, sort of disentangling it a little bit. Additionally, you may sort of look to Naomi Alderman's The Power, which likewise begins with a frame narrative on both ends. So it begins and ends with this frame narrative in which a fictional alderman and another historian called Neil Adam Arman are discussing the main narrative as a manuscript and are sort of chatting about that. So that's where we have kind of an inversion of the written and read endotext. If the written and read endotext sees characters writing or reading something, and the act of writing and reading that being narrativized for us as readers to see, the critical endotext treats the main narrative as a pre-existing thing, sometimes a written thing, sometimes just a sequence of historical events, and sees characters then discussing it. So although the main narrative is the embedded thing, that is obviously still the much more developed, much more fleshed out aspect of the novel, and is therefore, in my mind, sort of rightfully called the main narrative. But these endotexts that bookend it are not any lesser because of that. They're sort of doing an act of commentary, an act of criticism that you and I might do and kind of are doing now. But it's being narrativized and fictionalized for us as real readers to see as well.
So everybody's criticism is a critical endotext to the text it's appending, in effect.
Kind of, yeah, kind of. I guess just with the caveat that it doesn't solely exist within the story world.
Maybe we could look at some of the other instances of endotexts in 1984 and put them into your categories to really sort of solidify all this. I mean, the most obvious one is the Newspeak Appendix. Where does that fit into the schema?
The Newspeak Appendix is a critical endotext. The reason why is it's talking very explicitly about Winston's story world, and even directly mentions him by name once as well. It says sort of the records department in which Winston Smith worked, or something along those lines. So there we see that it is directly commenting on and sort of tearing apart and problematizing Winston's story world, the world in which he lives. And in particular, that is then looking at the language that, as everyone knows, the party is trying to construct. And interestingly, I think this endotext has received quite a lot of attention. As you say, it's quite an immediately obvious instance of an endotext in Orwell's novel, but it's very rarely dealt with as an endotext. So I see the Newspeak Appendix, obviously lots of criticism has been written about it, but often it falls into one of two camps. And these camps are on opposing sides of what I like to call the hope debate. So there's that very quickly banded out debate that the Newspeak appendix provides hope because it's not written in Newspeak, and therefore the party must fall. That's a pretty dominant line of argument about it in criticism. There is, on the other side, the lack of hope debate, the pessimistic debate, in which scholars say, well, that's a misreading. How dare you apply hope to a fairly pessimistic ending to the main narrative? Theo Finnegan writes a brilliant article in which he says, well, hang on, if O'Brien was able to allegedly co-construct the Goldstein's book, what's to stop the party from constructing the Newspeak appendix as well? And kind of, if they can write this text that tears apart their own ideology, how is it not also possible that they can also write a text that purports their demise? However, that hope debate, I think, is kind of a moot point, in that it sees scholars, academics, critics, whatever, look to the endotext to sort of resolve the story of 1984. And I think that is wrong, in essence. I think that's treating this endotext poorly, because it's doing so much more than just trying to resolve the story. And I argue that actually, with the Newspeak appendix, the fact that we have these two camps generated, but they can't actually be resolved. This is a perpetual battle. We see, additions to this hope debate continue and sort of be added time and time again. And I argue that actually the fundamental unresolvability of the principles of Newspeak, the fact that we cannot know for certain if it is trying to genuinely provide hope or if it is genuinely trying to deny hope at all and prevent hope from happening, means that we need to look at it and see what it's doing instead. Orwell's novel is, in my argument, above all else, about truth. It's about the beauty and importance of truth. It's about the fragility of truth, and it's about what happens when dominant forces seek to use, abuse, and corrupt truth. The unresolvability of the Newspeak appendix, in my mind at least, has us then question whether we can believe the things that we're reading, whether we as readers can look to the text for answers, can look to it for some sort of truth. And that, given that it's metafictional as well, I think sees Orwell invite his readers to not be skeptical of the things they read, but to be critical about the things they read, to question if the truths that they are seeing being written, or the ostensible truths they're seeing written, are in fact truths at all. He famously wrote, looking back on his time in Spain, of course, that he was seeing newspaper articles being written that were increasingly divorced from what actually happened and were being written according to party lines. I think this is something that really is apparent throughout Orwell's entire novel, and his endotexts in particular.
No, you're exactly right to link it to Spain. I mean, it's the motivating fear of 1984. I mean, before you even get to any consideration of totalitarianism, it's that basic anxiety over the status of truth and how easily it can be perverted, and how easily Orwell saw it being perverted when he was in Spain. So you're exactly right. What you've been saying prompts two thoughts in me. One is to ask, well, they're both questions actually. One is to say, were one to cut the endotext, or rather the appendix as endotext, were one to just jettison it, what does that do to all of this? Are these anxieties still present? Do we, can we detect them? Is it a sort of crutch to the reader? Is it a sort of an aid or a prompt that needs to be there or does not need to be there? Or if it's there, does it sort of make us think slightly differently? That's one question. The other one is, if I was understanding you correctly, when you were talking about the hope debate and the two sides of it, you had on the one hand those readers who see the ending as hopeful, in that the appendix is written in the past tense, and it seems to suggest that therefore Oceania fell away and Winston's world crumbled in some form, and something else came and took its place, good or bad, but nevertheless something different. And then on the other, you've got readers who are a little more skeptical and say, well, it could just be the party writing another document. and therefore another system of control, just as Goldstein's book is an instrument of control. How credible do you think it is that it's just something Orwell wrote to give us a bit more insight into the world? So there's two questions. There's that one, and also this sense of, whether the endotext, the appendix, is actually necessary or not.
To go to your first question about what would happen if we removed the Newspeak appendix, and I think also it's on that. It's not an uncommon reading experience for people to not read the Newspeak appendix. It's there in criticism, it's there in journalism. I know that even students that I've taught have skipped it because they thought it was just this random essay at the end of the novel. It's something that is routinely not read. If we were to go back to Lucien Dallenbach, where he says that texts express anxiety about their own readability, I do see, especially the fact that the Newspeak appendix is a critical endotext that occurs at the end of the novel as a whole. I do see it as functioning as a corrective to Winston's narrative, by which I mean the novel ends with obviously Winston being defeated. He loves Big Brother, and that's it. That is a message maybe of totalitarianism winning above all else, right? That rebels and contrarians will always fail in the face of totalitarianism. I think that's still an apt reading of the end of the main narrative and of Winston's story, but that's not a particularly inciting or didactic ending to the novel. It's not great for us as readers. It's not instilling anything in us. The endotext, through problematizing the truthfulness or the veracity of written documents and of things that maybe political figures are looking to use as tools of power, the metafictional element of that, I see, is looking to instill in Orwell's readers that desire and an ability maybe to avoid the same fate as Winston. So obviously, I don't think anyone's going to read 1984 and think, great, I want what happens to Winston. But I do think that the endotext then gives them a more effective tool or an effective method to implement to avoid that, rather than just this empty hope, this empty aspiration, this desire. We're actually given a workable means of dealing with that desire and avoiding the same fate as Winston. I forgot your second question.
So the second question was just to ask or to entertain the possibility that the endotext is just something Orwell wrote, just to give the reader a little more insight. I mean, is it no more than that? I mean, clearly you probably think differently, but I mean, what would you say to somebody who thought that?
So I would say that when looking at this endotext, so the Newspeak appendix, if we were to look at it in relation to the other major endotexts of 1984, we do see a recurrent theme about truth, about the precarity and fragility of truth, about the abuse of truth by totalitarian forces. Orwell fought to include the Newspeak appendix and Goldstein's book in the American edition of 1984. Famously, the Book of the Month Club said, "This is boring. We don't want it in there. Get rid of it, and then we'll have it." And Orwell said something along the lines of, in like a letter to his agent, I believe it was, said, "I simply can't stand for that. I cannot allow my work to be mucked around to that extent. If I were to do that, if I were to sort of concede to their demands, it would require completely reworking and reframing the novel as a whole, the narrative as a whole." So I believe Orwell does see these as having the endotext as having real importance and a real crucialness and essentialness to him conveying his message about truth in his work. Of course, it could very much just be him having a bit of fun, but I do question, and if I can maybe push back a bit, why can't his fun be purposeful as well? I think Orwell is very clearly trying to end his novel on that metafictional, that self-referential, that reflexive note that demands that readers do something about the issues apparent in the novel after reading it.
The Book of the Month Club sort of episode that you were just talking about, Orwell, I mean, we've been talking about what he said to his agent. Orwell says to the agent, "A book is built up as a balanced structure and one cannot simply remove large chunks here and there unless one is ready to recast the whole thing. I really cannot allow my work to be mucked about beyond a certain point, and I doubt whether it even pays in the long run. Sentiments that no doubt all authors express and hold to in one degree or another. But I mean, we're thinking now about Orwell at the end of his life. I mean, nearing the end of his life. He's an experienced novelist by this point, and a very experienced writer more generally. So he knows what he's doing, and he knows what he wants. So we've got this sense of needing to hold on to a structure because it matters. And that's where you're locating the importance of the endotext, yeah?
Yes, yeah, totally. I think, Orwell knew the writing game well enough. And if he thought the Newspeak Appendix and Goldstein's book in particular weren't important, weren't essential, and were just a bit of fun, a thought experiment, just a little bit of extra exposition, I do wonder if maybe he would have relented a lot easier. But the fact that he fought so vehemently for these, I think, speaks to their importance at large, as them not just being sort of a frivolity.
I've got two more questions for you, and then I think we're done, just in terms of the time. There's one about Orwell and one about Atwood. So the other one about Orwell is something that is mentioned every now and then, but it's not always paid attention to. It's this footnote that comes up at the beginning of the first chapter of part 1 of 1984, where you have the Ministry of Truth, mini-true in Newspeak, and then there's a superscripted 1, and there's a footnote. Newspeak was the official language of Oceania. For an account of its structure and etymology, see appendix. And I've seen arguments that say that there's an editor, there's a sort of invisible presence around the book that is, in some ways, maybe even going through this story as if it were a book that had been written, and 1984 is a kind of scholarly edition of a text that exists or existed in some fictional alterity. I mean, what do you make of it? Is that an endotext or is that not an endotext?
Yeah, I mean, so the footnote itself is an endotext. So I would call that another example of a critical endotext because it is treating the main narrative as something that can be commented upon, right? As an artifact, an object that can be commented upon. This is something that I do struggle to grapple with. I think it's very interesting, and it's something that I have not got any easy or straightforward answers to. What I might say though is, if we were to run with that argument of, this suggests that the main narrative as we have it belongs to a scholarly edition in a story world of some kind, that may also bring into doubt the authenticity and the veracity of this account. Again, if the party can write Goldstein's book, if it is plausible that they have written the Newspeak Appendix, then it is also possible that if this is an edited collection or an edited edition, rather, sorry, it's also plausible that they've had a hand in this. And so maybe that, is what I'm looking at now. It's a line and a half. It's not two very short sentences. Those sentences, that footnote, could bring the veracity of Winston's account into doubt. And once again aligns with, as I'm seeing it, Orwell's preoccupation with the truth and whether we can necessarily believe everything that we read. Again, going back to his example of the newspapers following Spain.
In some ways, there's a trap here, which is to try, not with the idea of endotextuality, but with the concept of whether the book itself is some kind of existing artifact in an alternate reality that the party have constructed and sent to us. And by trap, I mean it's impossible finally to verify, because you're dealing with hypotheticals within hypotheticals, and therefore one can't nail this down and can't try, and in some ways shouldn't try. I mean, fully and finally.
I think that's exactly the same thing of this hope debate with the Newspeak Appendix itself, is we keep on getting down into hypotheticals and what ifs, and rather, as an endotext, I just see it as raising a question. It's posing a question about the truthfulness, the veracity of the things we read. I think the footnote is actually doing exactly the same thing and conveniently relates to, of course, the appendix. It's not necessarily something that we should, obviously hypotheticals and thought experiments are fun, but I think they are just speculation. Whereas rather than speculating ourselves, I think the endotextual reading of that footnote and the Newspeak appendix lets us be aware of the speculation that the novel and its endotext in particular is generating. I think it's kind of a bit meta, but I think it is subtly different, but it's different enough, and I think that's why it matters.
It's a bit meta. it's obviously not a term Orwell would have used, but I think but you're exactly right, and also one can work with that in the sense that these possibilities and these intricacies and these wheels within wheels have been very generative for adapters of the novel. So the Ike and Macmillan stage performance or stage production and version of the play, adaptation of the novel, as a play, that takes these hypotheticals and these ambiguities as its point of departure, doesn't it? It is constructed precisely in this space. So there is a lot to work with. It's just, I think, if you're and you seem to be agreeing, if you're trying to construct an argument that says, I will solve fully and finally, once and for all, with the possibility of no further comeback, the question of whether 1984 is hopeful or not. I mean, at some level, it seems to be very po-faced a thing to try to do. I mean, we don't necessarily ask these questions of other kinds of novel. I mean, to take, in some ways, just a randomly chosen example, is Heart of Darkness true? I mean, it makes no sense as a question, to ask of that. But we're trying to ask a comparable question of 1984 here. Is it this? Is it that? And the answer surely is that it refuses the split. It refuses the binary by design. Right. One final question, and then I think I've taken up enough of your time. The text with which 1984 is so often compared is The Handmaid's Tale, which I know you're also a fan of. There are very productive and generative similarities at the endotextual level between these works. They both have a section at the end, the historical notes in Atwood, the Newspeak appendix in Orwell. They are metatextual in different but intriguingly sort of related ways. The main difference, though, is the very texture of the main story. 1984 is, for want of a better term, is a sort of traditional third-person narrative account told by some narrator, presence, figure, whatever that is, telling us the story at a remove of Winston Smith in a pretty unexceptional way, although some of the imagery that it uses does push against the limits of narrative realism. The Handmaid's Tale, by contrast, is a reconstructed text of testimony recorded to tapes that are then discovered and then reassembled by, I mean, this is a huge spoiler warning if you haven't read, not a warning, it's spoiled already. This is a huge giveaway to anyone who hasn't read the book, but it is an assembled narrative based on prior testimony that's recorded and that may not be complete. How do you sift between endotext there, or is there no complexity? Is it just that, in other words, I'm asking, is Offred's narration itself an endotext surrounding an absent center, or have I just got the wrong end of the stick?
So I would still very much see Offred's account, or what is ostensibly Offred's account, as the Handmaid's Tale's main narrative. And these are like terms that I keep on going back to, like the endotext versus the main narrative, even just for sake of ease. I think that what you're asking there about the assemblage of it and so on by James D'Arcy Piaciotto, that act of assemblage that is only revealed endotextually does raise similar questions about truth. Can we necessarily believe everything that Offred herself has said? Not in the sense of denying or silencing someone who is essentially a victim, her voice, but more a question of, because this is it was recorded after the fact, no one's memory is perfect, that sort of thing, which Piaciotto himself does raise. So both endotexts do begin to, so Newspeak Appendix and the historical notes, do both possess that question around truth and the veracity of the things that we read. I would say, and this is maybe to deviate slightly from your question, the same question around truth is also made of the things that Piaciotto himself says. So he overlooks an awful lot of Offred's account in order to propose his own very male-centered, very self-aggrandizing, very celebratory account of uncovering and reworking her account. And so in there, we do see a male figure imprint his own version of history, or using his own biases and his own ideologies, viewpoints, whatever you want to call it, using that to imprint on Offred's narrative. And so we have actually got two texts that are quite tense with regards to how much we can trust what's being said there. Do we completely take Offred's account at face value, her main narrative at face value, and trust everything she says? If so, Peixoto's account then, where he spends a great deal of time celebrating himself and his Professor Wade, Notley Wade, I think it is, their discovery of the recordings, their act to assemble them, spends a great deal of time talking about that. He then spends loads of time celebrating the men of The Handmaid's Tale, talking about how the two likely candidates for Fred, presumably, for the commander, that they are men of unquestionable genius, or words to that effect. He really celebrates them. If we believe Offred's account to be true, then Peixoto's cannot be. Like we cannot have those male figures being celebrated. Conversely, if Offred's account is, or if Peixoto's account is true, and these men are great innovators and all of the sort of sexist, snide remarks that Peixoto makes are perfectly legitimate, I'm hoping listeners can see where I'm sort of siding here, then we have to completely question what Offred is herself saying. And so there is that sort of tension between which text, if either can be said to be true, which text is that? Or is it actually a tug of war where there's this unresolvable tension? Once again, we once again see an unresolvable tension brought about by an endotext. And rather than, as I kind of just summarized, rather than trying to pick a side and disentangle that argument, it's in the tension where a lot of the really generative possibilities lie. It's in that tension, in the generation of so many arguments and thoughts and criticism around this matter. That's where Atwood, sorry, not Offred, that's where Atwood is inviting us to make these questions about not only truth, but truth in the context of who gets to record history. Whose histories do we read? Whose voices do we listen to? Whose voices do we appropriate? And what is the implication there for the bigger picture, i.e., the truth of the matter?
In some ways, the message of the novel lies in its indeterminacy rather than in its didacticism, sort of counterintuitively.
I think they're one and the same, though. I think the indeterminacy is didactic. It's in being unresolvable that Atwood and Orwell are offering these lessons to us. They're not offering easy answers. They're posing questions. I think that's like the real beauty of these endotexts.
It's reminding me of the end of an earlier novel by Orwell, A Clergyman's Daughter, where the main character, Dorothy, returns to what is initially presented as a stifling, authoritarian, patriarchal environment. But she goes back at the end and sort of slots herself back into it. And there's a question mark over the end about whether that's a willing or an unwilling thing. And you get some very strong readings that say it's unwilling, but it's not entirely unambiguous. And it may just be that Orwell didn't tie up his narrative threads particularly well. But there's also some scope to say that he's actually trying to prompt some question about free will and acceptance and happiness, and whether, in fact, the judgment of that character is warranted or not. Winston Smith certainly seems less troubled by the fact of having been tortured into compliance, because of course he has to be, because he's been tormented into compliance. So of course he's not going to be troubled. But then at the same time, you get these little sort of splinters coming through, like memories of the past that he has to bat away. So the control is not absolute, even though then one assumes he is eliminated, he's killed, he's shot. We could carry on talking. The point of these things is that they're unresolvable. So thank you so much for your time. Let's carry on reading and thinking about 1984 because it's too much fun to stop.
Thank you for having me, Nathan.